Hello, I'm Professor McCoige, and today I want to talk a little bit about Stoicism. So the Stoic tradition began with a philosopher named Zeno, but really picked up with a man named Epictetus in the 1st and 2nd centuries AD. Then moved forward through various Roman writers, perhaps culminating with the Emperor Marcus Aurelius. I'm mostly going to be talking today about Epictetus because he speaks the most simply and the most straightforwardly, and primarily in what we call aphorisms. So these short, relatively short, between a sentence and a paragraph or so, little sayings about life, about philosophy, about the mind, about how we deal with things. Really, he was a major proponent of philosophy as a way of living. This carried all the way through the Stoic tradition and was a very prominent element of classical philosophy. You can also point out a lot of similarities between the Stoic tradition and the Platonic tradition. Now, I will probably talk about some distinctively Platonic metaphysics and psychology in another video, or probably several other videos. But suffice it to say that Stoicism is, at least in some sense, drawing on a lot of Platonic ideas. So hopefully once, if you're familiar with the Platonic tradition, then you'll see some similarities. Otherwise, when I do get to talking about Plato, you'll see some similarities harkening back to what we're talking about today. So, okay, come on up. Okay. This is my cat. So, what about Stoicism? What am I here to talk about? Well, Epictetus's primary aphorism is that some things are up to us and some things are not up to us. More specifically, he means some things are entirely up to us and some things are not entirely up to us. So he draws this line between what's up to us and what's not up to us, the former being everything that's internal to our minds, and then what's not up to us is everything that's external to ourselves, everything to do with the world. So, for example, he thinks that things like emotions, things like our decisions or our choices, things like our reactions to things, these are all completely up to us. We decide on how to react to things, how to feel about things, how to consider things, and what to choose to do. On the contrary, what's not up to us are things that are external to us. So things that happen to us, things that happen in the world around you. So things that happen in the world around us. For example, what someone else chooses to do or what someone else chooses to think of us. For example, if someone wants to judge us for a particular social standing, say, right? So he points specifically to our reputation being not up to us. What other people do to us is not up to us. The fact that my cat decided to sit on my lap for part of this video was not up to me, that was up to her. The fact that I didn't shoo her aside and stop recording was up to me. So that's because the latter, me not shooing her away, was up to me, whereas her jumping up onto my lap, well, not jumping, but her coming over here was up to her. Yeah. So, okay, she wants to leave now. Bye, Angel. So, another important thing that's not up to us that Epictetus reminds us of, and then all of the Stoics subsequently remind us of this, is that the results of our actions aren't up to us. So, for instance, I can choose to throw a ball, right? I can choose to perform a particular action of physically moving my arm to throw something. Right? What I don't choose, what isn't entirely up to me, is, say, whether that ball goes through a hoop if I'm shooting a basketball. Right? That's not entirely up to me. That has to do with the external world, that has to do with the laws of physics, that has to do with external circumstances. Maybe I trip. That's not entirely up to me, right? That can happen against my will. Maybe I'm just not talented enough and I miss, which happens to be true. Maybe there was a breeze that I didn't account for, and the wind pushes the basketball aside before it gets to the hoop for playing outside, maybe. Maybe the point guard jumps up and hits the ball away before it gets through the hoop. That definitely wasn't up to me. That was his choice and his action, right? So, what we're pointing out here is that though we can control our choices, what we choose to do, the results of those choices aren't entirely up to us. What he means here is that, yeah, we can choose to do any given thing. What we can't choose is how that's going to turn out. So we can choose to pursue a particular vocation, or I can choose to post this to YouTube. But I don't control whether lots of people watch this, right? This could get 5 views, or this could get 5 million views. That's not up to me. That's up to you. This is also maybe a plug to share this video if you find it interesting. Sorry, I have to say that. So what's the point of all this? Well, by making this distinction between what's up to us and what's not up to us, Epictetus implores us to consider what we have control over and take that as our responsibility, while embracing the things that we don't have control over as out of our hands and something that we should accept happily. So this talks a lot about how we ought to deal with things that we encounter in life, right? So for instance, he speaks about, a lot actually, about the death of loved ones. And so this is something we all have to encounter, right? It's a part of life. And it's part of life that isn't in our control. We don't control when people we love die. And that's a terrible thing to deal with, right? But the Stoic outlook is to say of a loved one, the person I love is a human being. And death is characteristic of human beings. In other words, human beings eventually die. So knowing what kind of thing I'm loving, namely a human person, involves knowing that I'm not going to hold on to that person indefinitely. Right? So it's a way of looking at something that you do control, or something that you do have, in a way that accepts the parts you don't have control over. Because you have to remember, we do have complete control over our judgments and our reactions and our emotions. Right? Or at least the Stoics would claim. So what that means is we have control over how we react to things that happen to us. So a loved one dying, me missing my jump shot, which, these are very, opposite ends of the spectrum, but still, things that I do or things that happen around me that I have no control over. But Stoicism teaches us to accept these things and rejoice in the good we can find in them, right? So I can say that I choose to make this shot, but I don't choose whether it goes in or not. What I choose is to shoot the ball. And I can choose to do that to the best of my ability, and a Stoic would say that I ought to. However, I should, in so doing, embrace the fact that the result of that action isn't up to me. Similarly, a Stoic would say that I should, for instance, love my family with all that I have, but at the same time acknowledge and embrace the fact that my loved ones are just as fleeting as I am, right? So, maybe this sounds cold and maybe emotionless. That's not quite the case. So I want to draw a distinction here, because maybe we think of maybe well-known Stoics in popular culture, like Mr. Spock from Star Trek, for instance. Or maybe the Cybermen from Doctor Who are cold and emotionless, and they even purge emotions from themselves so they can be more logical. This isn't what Stoicism is really about. Because remember when I mentioned that Epictetus, at least, and all of the other Stoics include on the list of things that are up to us our emotions. right? So he thinks that we have absolute control over our emotions. Well, what he doesn't say is, well, you have that control, so you should choose to have no emotions. This is absolutely not the case. Instead, what he advises is that we choose to be happy about things that happen. Right? Things that we have no control over, he advises that we embrace them. So we take these things as either indifferent, so the sort of thing that just happens and that we ought to accept it, or take them as good. So for instance, say you have a crush on somebody. How about that? That's a good example. What you have control over in this instance is what you think of that person. Your desire for that person, your desire to be with that person, and your desire for that person to love you. Right? Now, what Epictetus would say is, don't desire for that person to love you. Simply love that person to start, right? So then, whether that person loves you or not, you can accept the consequence as either outside of your control or even good. For instance, maybe you express your love to this person, right? You tell your crush that you like them, you ask them out. Right? So, what can happen? Well, he can say yes, and you guys can fall in love and live happily ever after, and everything's wonderful. We all would agree that that's a good outcome, right? Alternatively, your crush can say, "Well, I don't feel the same way about you, but I think we should still stay friends." Right? So what you should do in that case, the Stoic would say, is embrace that friendship, because friendship is a good thing, right? So another way of putting that is, you should respond appropriately. So sure, you've got a crush on this person, but obviously they've expressed to you that they don't reciprocate those feelings. But what feelings they do have for you are feelings of friendship. So what should you do? You should respond in kind. You should respond appropriately as a friend. Alternatively, there's a third case. Maybe your crush says, "No, you're ugly and disgusting, and I want nothing to do with you." Well, that sucks, right? Obviously. But the Stoic would then say, all right, well, what do you do there? Well, somebody who thinks that you're ugly and disgusting, well, first of all, that doesn't have any effect on you, right? Somebody thinking that you're ugly and disgusting doesn't actually make you ugly or make you disgusting. No, not at all. What it does is it tells you something about that person. Right? So what you can do in that case is understand that this is a person who thinks poorly of me. Or perhaps this is a person who thinks more poorly of me than I deserve. So then you can say, well, this person doesn't want me in their life. Well, if they're that kind of a person, I don't want them in my life either, right? So that seems like a way of looking at this in a good light, even though it initially seems like a bad thing. And that's sort of a simple way of putting this Stoic method of dealing with external things. So in any case here, it doesn't matter what happens to us. In this case, where you've got a crush on somebody and you act on that, right? No matter what happens, you have a positive outcome. It just depends on how you consider it and how you react to it. Epictetus tells us specifically in cases like this that it isn't the thing happening to us that causes us distress or causes us harm. Rather, it's how we judge it, how we react to it. He says the same thing about death. He says that death isn't something to be feared. The only thing fearful about death is the way we approach it. So it isn't that Stoicism promotes cold, calculated, logical emotionlessness. What it says instead is that we ought to have positive emotions. We ought to be always joyful. But in order to do that, reason has to be in control over our emotion. We can't react angrily simply being controlled by our passions, acting passionately, which is shares the root of passive, right? We're controlled by our passions. A Stoic would say that's a bad thing. We ought to control ourselves using reason. And then as a result of that, we can have emotions. We can have positive emotions. So maybe a better example of a Stoic, rather than a Vulcan like Mr. Spock, maybe a better example would be Albus Dumbledore, right? From at least from the first few books or the first few movies, where he talks a lot about our choices making us who we are, not the things that happen to us, and that it's things that are up to us, our own choices, our own thoughts, our own judgments. That's what's important, and that's what makes us who we are. His attitude, at least Gambon's portrayal in the first couple of movies, is also very much, I think, like a Stoic sage. He's always portrayed as happy, but not in an overflowing kind of a way. Right? He's always responding to things that happen positively. He looks on the bright side, if you want to say that. I can point you back to where he says,
"But you know, happiness can be found even in the darkest of times, if one only remembers to turn on the light."
And what is that saying other than your response to something that seems terrible even, can make it into something happy? So that's the core of Stoic belief. It's understanding what is entirely up to us, namely what's internal to ourselves, and embracing control over that. Taking hold of our thoughts, our responses, our emotions, and letting go of the things that we can't hold on to. And this is, I think, a very important lesson for today. In fact, you see this kind of thing in cognitive or behavioral therapy. There will be a link to something more about that in the description below. But what I mean is that you'll find a lot of these therapeutic techniques teach us to respond to things that happen to us in a positive way, rather than choosing to take them as negative, take them as bad. And that's a lesson that we can and we really should take today from the ancient Stoics. It's perhaps a controversial point, if at least from some psychological perspectives, but it's a tried and it's a true method used over now centuries or even millennia, and many psychologists even today have found it to be an incredibly useful tool for dealing with problems. And there's a reason for that. It's that we really do have control over a lot of what goes on in our minds. Now, I can make a distinction between our minds and our brains, and that may come again in a later video. I don't really have the time for that now. But what goes on in our thoughts, in our minds, even in our what we might call our hearts, so in our emotions, in our passions, a lot of that has to do directly with the way we think. And the way we think is clearly up to us. And Epictetus would tell us to take hold of that and take control over what we have control over. And that's a good way of living. And that brings us back to the classical philosophy as teaching us how to live well. So hopefully, again, now, having said all that, hopefully this not only can teach you a little bit about the history of philosophy, but maybe can give you a helpful tip, helpful example of how to live happily in what is sometimes a dark world. So I'll leave you with that until the next video. I hope we've learned something, and I hope to see you next time.